We are moving in. Permanently. Brittany's voice carried across the snow-covered terrace before I even reached the front door, bright and confident, as if she were announcing a dinner reservation instead of claiming a home that was never hers. I stood still at the top of the stone steps, the cold alpine air settling into my lungs, sharp and clean at nearly 4,500 feet above sea level. The mountains behind her were silent, layered in white, ancient and unmoved by human entitlement. Daniel stood a few feet behind his wife, hands buried in the pockets of his wool coat, avoiding my eyes the way he used to avoid confessing to broken lamps when he was 10. I had bought the villa 6 months after my husband passed away. 32 years of marriage had left me with memories, investments, and a quiet understanding that life could change in a single afternoon. I did not buy this place on a whim. I bought it after spreadsheets, consultations, and long conversations with my attorney. I bought it because I wanted a space where the last third of my life would belong entirely to me. The villa sat on 3 acres of terraced hillside, built from stone and cedar, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the mountains like living paintings. The nearest village was 15 minutes down a narrow road that curved like a ribbon through pine trees. It was not extravagant in the way Brittany liked to define extravagance. There were no gold fixtures, no marble statues. Just clean lines, warm wood, and the kind of quiet you can only find far from a city. It just makes sense, Brittany continued, stepping closer as if closing a deal. This place is too big for one person, and we've been talking about a fresh start. The kids will love it here. We can enroll them in the international school. We. She kept saying we, as if the paperwork in my desk drawer had her name printed neatly beside mine. Daniel cleared his throat. Mom, we thought it would be better to tell you in person. Tell me. Not ask. Not discuss. Tell. I studied my son's face, the same blue eyes his father had, now clouded with something that looked uncomfortably like justification. I remembered another conversation, 3 years earlier, when Daniel had signed what he believed were updated insurance documents at the end of a long dinner. He had trusted me completely that night. I had told him it was simply prudent estate planning. He had not read past the first page. You should have told me sooner, Brittany added, brushing a snowflake off her sleeve. We already shipped some of our furniture. The movers are scheduled for Monday. I nodded once, slowly, as if considering a minor change to a dinner menu. Inside, the villa was warm. The heated floors hummed softly beneath the wide oak planks. A fire burned behind glass in the living room, steady and controlled. I had arrived 2 days earlier to prepare for their visit. I had walked through each room with deliberate care, not arranging throw pillows or placing flowers, but reviewing documents. 48 hours ago, I had made a phone call to Harold Simmons in Boston, the attorney who had handled our family trust for over a decade. I had asked him to activate a clause we had drafted quietly after my husband's diagnosis. Just in case, my husband had said back then, his voice calm even in uncertainty. I stepped aside and gestured toward the door. You'd better come in. It's cold. Brittany smiled in victory before she even crossed the threshold. Daniel hesitated, then followed her inside. The foyer opened into a vast living space with exposed beams and windows that stretched nearly 20 feet high. The mountains seemed close enough to touch. Brittany took 2 quick steps forward and stopped. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for something she expected to see. There were no family photographs. No children's toys. No personal clutter. Instead, the walls were clean, and at the far end of the room, mounted in understated brushed steel letters above the stone fireplace, were words that did not belong in a cozy mountain retreat, property held in trust. No beneficiary rights granted. Brittany blinked, as if her vision had fogged. What is that supposed to mean? She asked, her tone no longer bright. Daniel looked from the sign to me. Mom? I removed my gloves slowly, placing them on the console table by the door. It means exactly what it says, I replied, my voice steady and level. This villa is owned by the Whitmore Alpine Preservation Trust. I am the sole managing trustee. The fire crackled softly behind us. Outside, snow drifted from the eaves in small, silent cascades. Brittany's confidence thinned like mist in sunlight. "But you bought it," she said. "You said it was your retirement home." "It is," I answered. "But ownership and control are not always the same thing." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Are we beneficiaries?" he asked carefully. I met his eyes at last. No, the word did not echo. It did not need to. The mountains beyond the glass stood firm, indifferent and enduring. I had not raised my voice. I had not argued on the terrace. I had simply let them step inside and see what had always been there, waiting in plain sight. Daniel stared at the steel letters above the fireplace as if they might rearrange themselves into something more convenient, but they remained fixed and impersonal, as steady as the mountains beyond the glass. Brittany recovered first, her voice sharpening just slightly. "You cannot be serious. You bought this after Dad passed away. You told everyone it was your place." I walked past them into the living room, feeling the quiet warmth rising from the heated floors through the soles of my boots. "It is my place," I said calmly. "I live here. I manage it. I maintain it. But legally, it belongs to the trust." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a habit he had never outgrown. "Why would you do that?" he asked. Not angry yet. Confused. I turned to face him fully. "Because I learned a long time ago that ownership should be structured before expectations begin." The words settled between us. Brittany folded her arms. "So what does that mean for us?" There it was again. Us. As if the future had already been drafted without my signature. I walked to the wide window and looked out over the valley. Pine trees stretched downward in dark green waves, and a thin line of smoke rose from a distant chalet. The air outside was so clear you could see for miles. "It means," I replied, still looking outward, "that this property is preserved under a legal entity created for long-term stewardship. It cannot be transferred, reassigned, or occupied by any beneficiary without my written authorization." Daniel swallowed. "Are we beneficiaries at all?" I paused before answering, not for drama, but for precision. "You are contingent beneficiaries of certain financial instruments. Not of this property." Brittany let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "This is unbelievable. We already told the kids. We started planning. We thought you would be happy to have us close." I turned back toward her. "Did you ask me?" Silence answered for her. The fire continued its steady rhythm, the only thing in the room that did not seem unsettled. Daniel shifted his weight. "Mom, we assumed." "Yes," I said gently. "You assumed." I walked to the long wooden table near the kitchen and placed a slim leather folder on its surface. I had left it there deliberately. Inside were copies of the trust documents, stamped and notarized. I did not push it toward them. I simply rested my hand on top of it. "When your father was diagnosed," I said, my voice even, "we reviewed everything. Investments, properties, succession planning. We decided that any major asset purchased after his passing would be placed in protective structures. Not to punish anyone. To prevent misunderstandings." Brittany's composure thinned further. "Protective from what?" she asked. "From entitlement," I answered quietly. Daniel flinched at the word, not because it was loud, but because it was accurate. I remembered the conversation 3 years ago when he had signed those updated documents. He had trusted me without question, confident that his future was secure simply because he was my only child. He had not considered that security and access were not the same thing. "You made it impossible for us to build something here," Brittany said, her tone shifting from indignation to accusation. "We were counting on this." "Counting," I repeated softly. "On something you never owned." The room felt larger now, the high ceilings emphasizing the distance between us. Outside, a gust of wind brushed snow from the branches, sending a light cascade past the windows. Daniel looked at the steel letters again. So what exactly is this trust? He asked. It is an Alpine preservation trust, I explained. Its purpose is to maintain this property as a retreat and conservation investment. It is funded independently. It has its own maintenance accounts, insurance policies, and management guidelines. I am the sole managing trustee. Upon my passing, control transfers to a board. Not to an individual heir. Brittany's eyes widened slightly. A board? Yes, I said. 3 members. None of whom are you. The words were not cruel. They were factual. Daniel took a slow breath, as if recalibrating. You planned this for years. I planned responsibly, I corrected. Planning is not hostility. It is clarity. Brittany glanced toward the hallway, perhaps imagining where her furniture would have stood, where her children might have played. The vision no longer fit the architecture. So we cannot move in, she said flatly. Not as residents, I replied. You are welcome as guests when invited. This is not a family residence. It is a protected asset. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, the first visible sign that he understood the permanence of what he was hearing. We already put down deposits, he murmured. I did not respond immediately. I had learned that silence often carries more weight than argument. Finally, I said, then perhaps this is an expensive lesson in asking before declaring. Brittany turned toward him, frustration flickering across her face, but she said nothing. The mountains remained unmoved beyond the glass, their peaks untouched by our conversation. I walked back toward the fireplace and adjusted the small iron tool beside it, a simple, steady motion. I did not raise my voice on the terrace, I said quietly. I did not stop you from stepping inside. I wanted you to see this for yourselves. Daniel met my eyes at last, and for a brief moment I saw not the man negotiating his future, but the boy who once asked permission before climbing a tree. You never intended for us to have this, he said. I never intended for anyone to assume it, I replied. The fire burned steadily, contained and deliberate, much like the structure I had built around the life I had left. The silence after my last sentence did not feel dramatic, it felt instructional, as if the room itself were clarifying a boundary that had always existed but had never been spoken aloud. Brittany was the first to move. She walked slowly toward the large window, her heels soft against the oak floor, and stared out at the slope where snow rested in smooth, untouched layers. You could have told us, she said without turning around. We would not have made plans. I studied her reflection in the glass rather than her face. You did not ask, I replied. Daniel exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound of frustration he tried to hide. Mom, we thought this was the next step. You sold the house in Connecticut. You said you wanted something peaceful. We assumed that meant family nearby. I folded my hands loosely in front of me. Peaceful does not always mean crowded. The words were not sharp. They were steady. Brittany turned then, her composure rearranging itself into something more strategic. We were not trying to take anything from you, she said carefully. We just believed it made sense financially. Why keep a property this size to yourself? I walked toward the kitchen island and poured a glass of water, the simple motion giving space to the tension. Because I paid for it, I said plainly. Because I maintain it. Because I wanted a place that answers to me alone. Daniel stepped closer. We are your family. I met his eyes again. Yes. You are my family. That does not make you my board of directors. He looked away first. The trust had not been created in a moment of suspicion. It had been created in a moment of clarity. I remembered sitting beside my husband in our old study in Connecticut, reviewing asset allocations while late autumn rain tapped against the windows. He had squeezed my hand and said, if you ever start over somewhere new, make sure it stays yours. Not out of distrust. Out of dignity. I had listened. Brittany crossed her arms again, a familiar posture when she felt control slipping. So what happens when you are gone? She asked. Does this just sit here empty? The question was practical, but beneath it lay calculation. When I am gone, I said calmly, the property remains under the trust. It may operate as a retreat. It may be leased seasonally. It may be preserved indefinitely. That decision will not rest on inheritance expectation. Daniel frowned slightly. You are saying we get nothing from this? I shook my head. I am saying you were never entitled to this. The distinction mattered. Outside, the late afternoon light shifted, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The mountains did not argue. They endured. Brittany walked toward the leather folder on the table and opened it without asking. Pages rustled softly. She scanned the headings, the formal language, the notary stamps. You did this before we even knew about the villa, she said. Yes, I answered. Before anyone could imagine moving in. Daniel rubbed his temples briefly, as if trying to reorganize the future in his mind. We already transferred some funds for renovations, he said quietly. Custom cabinetry. Flooring. We thought we were improving it. I looked at him with steady patience. You were improving something you assumed would belong to you. He had no answer for that. Brittany closed the folder with a controlled motion and placed it back on the table. This feels like a message, she said. It is, I replied. It is a message that ownership requires permission, not assumption. The fire behind me continued to burn evenly, contained within its glass enclosure. I had always preferred controlled warmth to unpredictable sparks. Daniel stepped toward the window again, his reflection overlapping with the steel lettering on the wall. We wanted stability, he said. The market is uncertain. Schools are competitive. We thought consolidating here would secure things. I nodded slightly. Security built on someone else's asset is not security. It is dependency. Brittany inhaled slowly, her tone shifting once more. So what do you expect us to do now? I considered the question without hurry. Find a place that is yours, I said. Build something that does not rely on my signature. The room fell quiet again. No raised voices. No dramatic gestures. Just the slow recalibration of expectation. Daniel finally looked at me with something different in his eyes, not resentment, not anger, but recognition. You planned this because you saw this coming, he said. I did not smile. I planned this because I have lived long enough to understand how quickly assumption becomes demand. Brittany glanced once more at the mountains, then back at the steel letters above the fireplace. The words had not changed. They were not emotional. They were structural. I walked toward the entryway and picked up my gloves. You are welcome to stay for dinner, I said evenly. As guests. The distinction remained clear, suspended in the warm Alpine air like a boundary drawn in snow that no one could pretend not to see. Dinner was quiet in the way only strained family dinners can be quiet, not empty of sound but heavy with unspoken recalculations. I moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm, placing a cast iron skillet on the induction cooktop, slicing vegetables with slow, even motions, listening to the low murmur of Daniel and Brittany speaking near the windows. The villa felt different now, not because anything had changed structurally, but because expectation had been removed from the air. When expectation leaves a room, the space expands. You planned all of this without telling us, Brittany said again, her voice more measured than before. I did not turn around. I planned my retirement, I answered. That is not a secret. That is responsibility. Daniel stepped into the kitchen, resting his hands on the edge of the island. Mom, you could have trusted us. I placed the knife down and faced him fully. Trust and access are not the same thing, I said quietly. I trust you to live your life. I do not owe you control over mine. He looked as though he wanted to argue, but the words did not form. I saw the tension in his shoulders, the internal negotiation between loyalty and pride. Brittany remained near the fireplace, scrolling through her phone briefly, perhaps checking on the movers she had so confidently scheduled. I wondered if she was calculating cancellation fees. We already paid deposits, Daniel repeated, softer now. Non-refundable. I nodded once. Then let that be tuition, I said. Some lessons are expensive. The scent of rosemary and garlic filled the kitchen as I added olive oil to the pan. Outside, the sky deepened into shades of blue and violet, the last light reflecting off the snow in pale silver streaks. I had always believed that major conversations should happen in calm environments. That was why I had not confronted them on the terrace. I had wanted walls around us, warmth beneath our feet, and documents within reach. Brittany finally walked toward the kitchen, her composure rebuilt but thinner. You think we were trying to use you, she said. I think you were planning a future that included assets you did not secure, I replied. There is a difference. She opened her mouth to respond, then paused. Perhaps she realized that indignation would not move legal language. Daniel looked from her to me. What if we had asked, he said. I met his eyes steadily. Then we would have discussed boundaries. You might have visited for seasons. You might have contributed as guests. But ownership would never have been assumed. The word assumed lingered again, not as accusation but as diagnosis. I carried the skillet to the table and set it down on a thick wooden trivet. The sound was solid and grounded. Your father and I worked for decades, I continued. We made careful investments. We paid off mortgages early. We avoided debt whenever possible. Not because we were fearful, but because we valued independence. I will not exchange that independence for proximity. Brittany leaned against the back of a chair, her posture less confrontational now, more contemplative. So this is about control, she said. No, I answered. This is about clarity. Daniel sank into one of the dining chairs and exhaled slowly. We thought being close would make things easier, he said. For the kids. For you. I poured water into 3 glasses, the simple act steadying the rhythm of the room. If you want to be close, I said, you can visit. Distance is measured in miles. Entitlement is measured in assumptions. Outside, a light began to glow in the valley below as other chalets switched on their evening lamps. The world continued without consulting our disagreement. Brittany traced a finger along the edge of the table, her earlier certainty replaced by calculation. You really would have let us move in if we had not seen that sign, she said quietly. I shook my head. I would have stopped you before the first box crossed the threshold. But this way, you understand why. Daniel finally looked at the steel letters again. You wanted us to feel it, he said. I considered that. I wanted you to see it, I corrected. There is a difference between emotion and evidence. The trust was not a punishment. It was structure. The villa was not a battleground. It was a boundary. I took my seat at the table and folded my napkin on my lap, the motion calm and practiced. You are welcome here tonight, I said evenly. But tomorrow, you will return to a life that is yours to build. The fire continued to burn steadily behind us, contained and reliable. No one raised their voice. No one stormed out. The mountains remained silent witnesses beyond the glass, ancient and indifferent to inheritance debates. For the first time since they stepped onto the terrace, the air felt clear again. Not warm with agreement, but clean with truth. The next morning arrived with a stillness that felt earned rather than accidental. Snow had fallen lightly through the night, softening the edges of the terrace and covering the narrow road that curved down toward the village. I was already awake before sunrise, standing by the window with a cup of black coffee warming my hands. The mountains were pale blue in the early light, layered and distant, unconcerned with human disappointment. I heard movement behind me around 7 o'clock. A suitcase wheel rolled across the oak floor, then stopped. Brittany appeared in the hallway first, her posture composed but quieter than the day before. Daniel followed, carrying 2 smaller bags. They both looked as though they had slept very little. We changed the movers, Daniel said, his voice steady but subdued. They are not coming. I nodded once. That was wise. Brittany set her handbag on the entry table and glanced toward the steel lettering above the fireplace again. It did not intimidate her now. It simply existed. "We will handle the deposits," she said. "We made the calls last night." I appreciated that she did not attempt to negotiate further. The conversation had moved from confrontation to consequence. "I hope the cancellation fees were manageable," I replied evenly. Daniel gave a small, humorless smile. "Expensive lesson," he said. "Yes," I answered. "But not the most expensive one you could have learned." He understood what I meant. There are financial losses and there are structural losses. One can be recovered. The other changes a life. I placed my coffee cup down and walked toward the coat rack. "You are welcome to visit in the summer," I said. "The hiking trails are clearer then. The wildflowers cover the lower slopes." Brittany looked at me, studying my expression for something that might resemble triumph. There was none. "As guests," she said quietly. "As guests," I confirmed. Daniel slipped his arms into his coat and paused before zipping it. "Mom," he began, then hesitated. I waited. "Did you ever plan to tell us?" he asked. It was not an accusation this time. It was curiosity mixed with humility. I considered the question carefully. "I planned to show you when it mattered," I said. "If you had asked about the structure before declaring residency, I would have explained it then." He nodded slowly. Brittany adjusted her scarf, her movements deliberate. "I thought this was security," she admitted. "For our children." I looked at her without hostility. "Security is built on assets you earn, not assets you assume," I said. "If you want stability for your children, build it directly. Do not anchor it to someone else's foundation." The words were not meant to diminish her. They were meant to redirect her. Outside, the snow reflected the growing sunlight, bright and clean. Daniel lifted the larger suitcase and moved toward the door. He stopped once more before opening it. "You knew we would see that sign," he said. "Yes," I replied. "I needed you to understand that this is not a misunderstanding. It is a boundary." He nodded again, this time with less resistance. Brittany reached for the door handle but did not pull it immediately. "You really are not angry," she said, almost as if testing the idea. I allowed myself a small, restrained smile. "Anger is loud," I said. "Clarity is quiet." She studied me for another second, perhaps realizing that the power in the room had never been about emotion. It had been about preparation. Daniel finally opened the door. Cold mountain air slipped inside briefly before they stepped out onto the terrace. I followed them a few steps behind, not to escort them away, but to stand where the declaration had been made the day before. The snow beneath our boots compressed with soft, muted sounds. Daniel placed the suitcases in the trunk of their rental car, a dark sedan that looked small against the wide Alpine landscape. Brittany closed her door and looked back at the villa, its stone exterior glowing faintly in the morning light. "It is beautiful," she said. "Yes," I replied. "It is." Daniel approached me once more before getting into the car. "We will call you when we get back," he said. "You do not need to call out of obligation," I answered. "Call when you want to talk." He gave a slight nod, a gesture that carried more respect than the day before. When the engine started, the sound felt temporary, fragile against the vast quiet around us. They drove slowly down the narrow road, tires crunching over fresh snow, until the car became smaller and smaller, then disappeared behind the curve of pine trees. I remained on the terrace for several minutes after they were gone. The air was cold but steady, and the mountains stretched endlessly before me. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel vindicated. I felt aligned. I had not raised my voice. I had not argued. I had not needed to. Structure had spoken where emotion might have failed. After a while, I stepped back inside and closed the heavy wooden door. The villa was quiet again, not empty, but intentional. The steel lettering above the fireplace remained in place, not as a warning, but as a reminder. Ownership is not declared. It is documented. And documentation, when prepared in advance, does not shout. It simply stands. The villa settled into its rhythm again after they left, the kind of rhythm that is not measured in noise but in intention. I spent the afternoon reviewing maintenance reports from the local property manager, confirming snow removal schedules and inspecting the backup generator logs. Structure had protected the asset, but structure also required upkeep. Independence is not passive. It demands attention. 2 days passed before Daniel called. His name appeared on my phone screen just after 6 in the evening, as the sun lowered behind the peaks and turned the snow a soft amber. I let it ring once more than necessary before answering, not to assert dominance, but to ensure I was calm. "Hello, Daniel," I said evenly. There was a short pause on the other end. "We made it home," he replied. His voice sounded different, less certain, more reflective. "The drive down the mountain was slow, but we are back." "I am glad you traveled safely," I said. I moved toward the window as we spoke, watching a thin veil of clouds move across the valley. "We have been talking," he continued. "About everything." I waited without filling the silence. "I think we confused access with inheritance," he said finally. The admission was quiet but clear. "That is common," I answered. "It is also correctable." He exhaled softly. "Brittany is disappointed," he said. "She believed consolidating near you would strengthen the family." I considered my response carefully. "Strength built on expectation weakens quickly," I said. "Strength built on earned ground lasts longer." There was another pause. "You really do not regret it," he said. "The trust." I looked at the steel lettering above the fireplace, illuminated by the soft glow of the recessed lights. "No," I replied. "I regret misunderstandings. I do not regret preparation." He was quiet again, then spoke with a tone that carried more humility than before. "I signed those estate updates years ago without reading them closely. I trusted you." "You were right to trust me," I said. "And I was right to structure things clearly. Trust does not eliminate documentation. It coexists with it." "I see that now," he said. "We are looking at properties closer to our current town. Something within our own budget." The words were simple, but they carried weight. They signaled a shift from assumption to initiative. "That is a wise direction," I replied. "When you purchase something you can call entirely your own, the pride feels different." He was silent for a moment longer. "Dad would have supported this, would he not?" he asked. I felt the question settle in the air. "Your father believed in self-sufficiency," I said. "He believed families should support each other emotionally, not financially by default. He wanted you to build, not inherit prematurely." Daniel's breath steadied on the other end of the line. "I think we misunderstood what support looks like," he admitted. "Support is presence," I said. "It is advice when asked. It is dinner invitations. It is not automatic access to someone else's portfolio." I could almost hear him nod. "Brittany wanted certainty," he said. "The economy feels unstable. Schools are competitive. She thought proximity to you meant safety." "Safety is not geographical," I replied. "It is structural." I walked toward the kitchen and set a kettle on the induction surface, listening to the quiet hum as it began to heat. "Are you angry with us?" he asked. The question was softer now, stripped of defensiveness. "No," I said honestly. "I am relieved that we addressed it early. Conflict left unattended grows roots. Conflict addressed becomes boundary." "We will visit in the summer," he said. "If you invite us." "You will be invited," I answered. "As guests." There was no tension in the distinction this time. Only clarity. "Thank you," he said. The gratitude sounded genuine. After we ended the call, I stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the kettle click off automatically. The villa felt steady, not triumphant. I had not severed anything. I had adjusted expectations. Later that evening, an email arrived from Brittany. It was brief, composed carefully. She acknowledged the trust, apologized for assuming residency, and stated that they were focusing on securing a home independently. There was no resentment in her wording, only recalibration. I replied with equal brevity, wishing them clarity in their search and reminding them that visits would always be welcome. Outside, the sky darkened fully, and stars began to appear above the mountain. Ridges, sharp and unfiltered by city light. I turned off the overhead lights and let the fire burn low behind the glass. Structure had not divided us. It had defined us. The villa remained exactly what it was intended to be, a place of quiet ownership, documented and deliberate. And for the first time since the declaration on the terrace, the silence felt uncomplicated. Spring arrived gradually in the Alps, not with sudden warmth but with small permissions. Snow receded in uneven patches across the hillside, revealing dark soil and stubborn blades of grass beneath. I watched the transition from the terrace most mornings, a cup of coffee steady in my hands, noticing how change never argues with the mountain. It simply advances, inch by inch. Daniel called again in early April. This time his voice carried something lighter. "We found a house," he said. I sat at the long oak table where the leather folder still rested, though it had not been opened in weeks. "Tell me about it," I replied. "It is about 20 minutes from our current place," he said. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, built in the late 1990s. It needs some updating, but it is within our range. The yard is modest, about a quarter acre. The kids can walk to school. I could hear movement in the background, the distant sound of children's laughter and a door closing. "That sounds practical," I said. "Practical is good." He paused briefly. "We qualified on our own," he added, not proudly, but firmly. I allowed myself a small smile. "That matters," I said. "It will always matter." Later that afternoon, Brittany sent photographs. The house was not dramatic. Beige siding, a simple porch, a maple tree in the front yard. The kitchen had oak cabinets and laminate countertops. It was not a villa in the Alps. It was something else entirely. It was theirs. I replied with a brief message complimenting the natural light in the living room and the size of the backyard. She responded with thanks, her tone warmer than before. The sharp edges had softened into something more measured. A week later, they invited me to visit for the inspection. I agreed, not as an investor, not as a co-signer, but as a mother. The flight back to the United States felt different than it had months earlier when I had sold the Connecticut house and closed that chapter of my life. This time I traveled with clarity rather than transition. When I arrived, Daniel met me at the airport. He looked steadier, less defensive. "We wanted you to see it before closing," he said as we drove toward the neighborhood. The subdivision was quiet, lined with similar homes, each one modest but maintained. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Lawns were trimmed evenly. There was no marble foyer, no panoramic mountain view. There was something else instead. Ownership earned through effort. Brittany greeted me at the door with a composed smile. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her tone held no entitlement now. Only invitation. Inside, the house smelled faintly of fresh paint. They had already chosen lighter colors for the walls. Daniel walked me through each room, pointing out where they planned to refinish floors, where they intended to update fixtures over time. "We will do it gradually," he said. "Within our means." I nodded. "Gradual is sustainable," I replied. We stood in the small backyard for a moment, the maple tree casting soft shadows across the grass. "It is not the Alps," Brittany said quietly. I looked at her. "It does not need to be," I answered. "It needs to be yours." She met my gaze without defensiveness. "I understand that now," she said. There was no apology in her words, but there was recognition. That was enough. During dinner that evening, Daniel spoke openly about budgeting, about managing renovations carefully, about building equity rather than depending on proximity to mine. The conversation felt grounded, not aspirational. I listened more than I spoke. When it was time for me to leave, Brittany walked me to the door. "We misjudged you," she said softly. "No," I replied. "You misjudged the structure." She gave a small, acknowledging nod. On the flight back to the Alps, I reflected on how quickly assumptions can shift when confronted with documentation. The trust had not fractured the family. It had redirected it. When I returned to the villa, the mountains were greener, patches of wildflowers emerging along the lower slopes. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, the familiar quiet welcoming me without question. The steel lettering above the fireplace remained in place, unchanged, not as a barrier but as a reminder. Boundaries do not isolate. They define. I placed my suitcase in the hallway and opened the wide windows to let fresh Alpine air move through the rooms. In the distance, I could hear cowbells from a nearby pasture, steady and rhythmic. Daniel had built something that was his. Brittany had adjusted her expectations to fit reality rather than assumption. And I had preserved what was mine without shouting, without severing, without regret. The villa stood exactly as it was intended to stand, documented, deliberate, and unclaimed by anyone who had not earned it. Summer settled gently over the Alps, replacing the sharp white silence of winter with deep green slopes and bright alpine flowers that moved lightly in the breeze. The villa felt different in warm weather, not softer, but more open. I kept the wide windows tilted inward during the day, allowing clean mountain air to move through the rooms. Cowbells echoed faintly from distant pastures, steady and unhurried. In late June, Daniel called again, this time with a tone I had not heard in months. "We closed," he said. "It is official." I stood by the terrace doors as he spoke, watching sunlight reflect off the valley below. "Congratulations," I replied. "That is an important milestone." He laughed quietly. "It feels different signing something that depends entirely on us." There was pride in his voice now, not borrowed confidence, not assumed entitlement, but earned ownership. "That feeling will stay with you," I said. "It anchors decisions." Brittany joined the call briefly. Her voice was calm, no longer sharpened by expectation. "We planted a small garden," she told me. "Tomatoes and herbs. The kids wanted to help." I could hear children running in the background again, the sound ordinary and grounded. "Gardens teach patience," I said. "You cannot rush growth." After the call ended, I walked through the villa slowly, not inspecting it for threats or vulnerabilities, but simply acknowledging its quiet strength. The trust documents remained stored securely in the study, unchanged and unnecessary to revisit. Boundaries, once understood, do not require constant defense. In early July, I sent an invitation for them to visit in August. I wrote it clearly, "We would be happy to host you for 1 week as guests." The wording was deliberate but warm. Daniel responded with gratitude. Brittany replied separately, confirming travel dates and asking whether there were hiking trails suitable for children. The question made me smile. It was no longer about moving in. It was about visiting well. When they arrived in August, the mountains were vivid and alive. Wildflowers dotted the hillsides, and the air carried the scent of pine warmed by sunlight. I stood on the terrace as their rental car pulled into the gravel drive. This time, there were no declarations, no assumptions. The children ran ahead first, their excitement uncomplicated. Brittany stepped out next, looking up at the villa with appreciation rather than calculation. Daniel approached me with an easy expression. "Thank you for having us," he said. "We are glad you are here," I replied. Inside, the steel lettering above the fireplace remained in place, but no one stared at it. It had become background rather than barrier. The week unfolded simply. We hiked narrow trails that curved through the hills for 3 or 4 miles at a time, stopping to rest when the children grew tired. We shared meals at the long wooden table, not discussing ownership or structure, but school plans and garden progress. One evening, Brittany stood beside me on the terrace as the sun dipped behind the peaks. I used to think proximity meant security, she said quietly. Now I see security is built elsewhere. I nodded. Proximity is a gift, I said. Security is a foundation. She looked out at the mountains for a long moment. I appreciate that you did not shout, she added. You did not need to, I replied. The air between us felt steady, not intimate, not strained, simply clear. Daniel joined us with 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed one to me. We are budgeting for new kitchen counters next year, he said. Granite, maybe. Nothing dramatic. I smiled slightly. Incremental improvements last longer, I said. On their final morning, the children hugged me before climbing into the car. Daniel shook my hand briefly, then pulled me into a quiet embrace. Thank you for teaching us without humiliating us, he said. I stepped back and met his eyes. You taught yourselves, I answered. Brittany offered a composed smile. We will come back next summer, she said. If invited. You will be invited, I replied. As their car disappeared down the narrow road once again, I remained on the terrace, but this time the air carried no tension, only lightness. The villa stood behind me, steady and documented, not threatened, not contested. Structure had not divided us. It had clarified us. I turned and walked inside, closing the heavy wooden door gently. The mountains outside remained vast and unchanged, but the distance between us had shifted. Not measured in miles. Measured in understanding. Autumn returned quietly, painting the lower slopes in shades of gold and deep rust while the peaks remained lightly dusted with early snow. The villa felt settled in a way that no longer required proof. I moved through my mornings without reviewing documents, without anticipating challenges. Structure, once tested, does not need to be defended daily. In October, Daniel called with news that carried neither tension nor request. We refinanced, he said. The interest rate dropped slightly. It will save us a few $100s each month. His voice held practical satisfaction. That is smart timing, I replied. Small adjustments accumulate. He laughed softly. I hear you in my head when we make decisions now. There was no resentment in that admission. Only acknowledgement. Brittany sent photographs of the updated kitchen counters a few weeks later. They chose a simple gray stone, durable and understated. The children stood in the background of one picture, grinning, flowers smudged lightly across their shirts from baking cookies. The house looked lived in, not curated. It looked earned. I printed one of the photographs and placed it in a slim silver frame on the shelf in my study. Not because I needed a reminder, but because pride should be visible when it is deserved. As winter approached again, the first snowfall arrived earlier than expected. I stood on the terrace and watched flakes gather along the railing, soft and deliberate. I remembered the day Brittany had declared, "We are moving in." The words felt distant now, not erased, but transformed into something instructional. Assumption had been replaced with initiative. Proximity had been replaced with independence. In December, Daniel called to ask whether I would join them for the holidays. We would like to host this year, he said. The wording mattered. Host. I accepted. Their home was modest compared to the villa, but when I stepped inside, it felt warm in a way square footage cannot measure. The maple tree in the front yard was wrapped in simple white lights. The living room was arranged carefully, furniture positioned to create conversation rather than display. Brittany greeted me at the door with a steady smile. Welcome, she said. Not. Welcome back. Not welcome home. Just welcome. The distinction felt respectful. During dinner, Daniel spoke openly about managing expenses, about balancing mortgage payments with school costs. He asked for advice, not access. I offered perspective, not funding. The children showed me their small garden, now dormant under winter frost, explaining how they would expand it in the spring. Ownership had shifted from concept to habit. Later that evening, Brittany joined me in the kitchen while Daniel cleared the table. I am glad we did not move into the villa, she said quietly. I turned to look at her. So am I replied. She hesitated briefly. It would have changed things, she added. Yes, I said. It would have blurred lines that are clearer now. She nodded. There was no tension in the exchange. Only understanding. When I returned to the Alps after the holidays, the villa greeted me with its familiar silence. Snow covered the terrace once more, clean and undisturbed. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the steel lettering above the fireplace catching the soft afternoon light. It no longer felt like a declaration. It felt like architecture. I removed my coat and walked through the rooms slowly, noticing how nothing had been compromised, nothing surrendered, nothing taken for granted. I sat by the fire that evening, listening to the quiet hum of the heating system and the faint whistle of wind along the eaves. I did not feel isolated. I felt aligned. The trust had not been about control. It had been about continuity. It had ensured that this place would remain intentional, not inherited through assumption but encountered through invitation. My relationship with Daniel and Brittany had not weakened. It had matured. Boundaries, when drawn calmly, do not sever bonds. They define them. Outside, the mountains stood vast and indifferent to family dynamics, their presence unchanged by human expectation. Inside, I understood something that only time can teach. Ownership is not loud. It does not require argument. It does not compete for validation. It is documented quietly, maintained consistently, and respected when clarity replaces assumption. The villa remained mine, not because I defended it with emotion, but because I secured it with structure. And the family remained intact, not because I surrendered boundaries, but because I kept them steady.